Good morning. I am Sevilay Güven. I'm the Secretary General of YASAD, the Software Industrials Association for Turkey. We are happy to have you all here together with the third series webinar with dear Hans Peter Bech. I would like to give the speech to Mr. İlhan Bağören, who is a member of the YASAD Administrative Committee and also the CEO of the Telenity company. Good morning, İlhan.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this great webinar to listen to experiences of Hans Peter. I am one of the board members of YASAD and also the board member of Exporters Association. We have been trying to bring our technology-rich companies to also sales-rich companies by bringing other aspects of success in the international markets other than technology. For so long, we have been building up our technology background of SMEs in Turkey successfully through grants and support of TÜBİTAK and other such government agencies, as well as a very rich defense technology. The technological level of Turkish companies has been quite at par with the leading other countries. However, we have been struggling with productization, commercialization, and exports. We have addressed some of these issues by talking about product management in the past. But as well as product management, international sales organizations are key ingredient that is missing from many of our SMEs and startups. To fill that gap, one of the better known experts in the field, Hans Peter Bech, has been communicating with our companies for 10 years now. He has been with us 10 years ago at the very first software URGE that was brought by IMIP and TEDsoft. So he knows Turkish markets, Turkish ecosystem very well, and he's going to share his excellent experience that is highlighted by how they took Damgard Navision to be the centerpiece of Microsoft's ERP, mostly by establishing a very good international representative market.
Well, I would like to say a few words about YASAD as well, as we have attendees who are not members of YASAD. YASAD is celebrating the 30th year this year, so we are representing the Turkish software industrialist companies since 30 years in Turkey. So for Turkey, it's a long time, but the software industry in Turkey has a past of 50 years. The biggest companies. One of the biggest companies, Netaş, has been celebrating 56 years this year. So what are we doing? We are representing the software industry in Turkey towards the governmental bodies, ministries, and we are promoting to usage of local software, Turkish software, in all means, in the government, in industrial companies in Turkey. And we are promoting to our companies to export, in fact. We are in connection with the Ministry of Technology and Industry, with the Ministry of Trade for the exports, with the Ministry of Telecommunications and Background Works. And one side, as we are promoting upon these governmental bodies the needs of software industry. On the other hand, we are working with our companies, members, to improve their success in exportation. So we are happy to announce that this year we have achieved to make it publish a big support package from the Ministry of Trade, which will reinforce the exportation of software companies. It is created only for software companies, so we are very happy about it. And these studies, or these the help of professionals like Hans Peter Bech to improve the globalization and exportation of software companies will find their support with these special packages as well, starting from this year.
Great. Hello everybody. It's nice to see number of attendees in software industry. Let me share my special thanks first to the YASAD and İlhan Bey, Sevilay Hanım. They support the community too much. They encourage the community. Thanks for it, and they let us to prepare this webinar series. My name is Burak Nesli Türk. I am software product marketing consultant at Qualified One. And we'll prepare this webinar series, as you know, with Hans Peter. Peter, welcome and hello. In this webinar series, we discuss how software companies can grow their international business without having a big budget. The reason of our interest in global markets is they represent much more potential than the domestic markets, and of course, different challenge, you know. For example, according to research, Turkey represents less than 2% of the global market for software products. This means 98% of the global market is outside Turkey. However, these 98% are in the markets are far away from each other, and they have different requirements and have often strong competitors that we have never heard of. The theme of this webinar is therefore how to choose the best opportunities, because before we go outside our country, there are kinds of markets, and we should decide where to start. Peter, maybe you know, discuss how to select markets in his recent book, Going Global on a Shoestring. So, Peter, please explain us, how do we do it? How do we identify the most attractive markets for our products?
Good morning, everybody. I'm sitting here in my home office about 35 kilometers north of Copenhagen, while you guys are sitting in Istanbul. It's quite fascinating. Also, thank you very much to İlhan and Sevilay and YASAD for the introduction and for hosting these software industry-specific business development webinars. I have been looking very much forward to this discussion today, because I know this subject is on the agenda of any software company with international ambitions. So with these words, let's dig into the challenge. And I will start answering your question with what we can call the easy case. And let me just give you another slide here. Sometimes you don't even have to identify and pick a specific country or market. As I describe in the book, Going Global on a Shoestring, there are products that are so generic that they don't need any localization. They can be used as they are in any industry. There may even be a global market for just the English version of a product. In some niches, English only is fully acceptable. Now, in other segments, you may not get deep penetration with an English version only, but it can be a good place to start. Those were some key considerations that concerned the product. Now, let's look at the challenge from the revenue generation perspective. How do you get your value proposition in front of potential customers in new markets? I think that is the main challenge that we're going to discuss today. For certain products, selling them doesn't require that you have any feet on the ground, that you have any staff in the individual country. For certain products, all customer interaction can be done virtually and maybe even asynchronously. And in such situation, there's no need to pick a market. You can run your global business from your current office, maybe complemented with some freelance resources that can be located anywhere in the world. And even if you need to master the local language, French, German, Dutch, or whatever, the fact that you don't need to meet physically, face-to-face with your customers, will enable you to run your operations from any location, or even in a fully remote and virtual format. All you must do is invest in a professional presence on the web and in lead generation activities. And with that, you can generate revenue from customers all over the world. Examples of well-known companies that started this way are Salesforce, Atlassian, Basecamp, Zendesk, Soho, WordPress, and HubSpot. Those are the well-known names. If you want lesser known names, you can find more examples in my book, Going Global on a Shoestring. So let me stress this opportunity once more, because it is an opportunity that is available to a lot of software companies. You need to find out if you can generate revenue and serve your customers without having to meet them physically face-to-face. It may not be acceptable to all potential customers, but if it is acceptable to a significant segment in a market, that can be a great way to start. And I think we should remember that the pandemic we just had the last 2 years has actually increased the threshold for what type of products you can sell on a virtual basis.
Great. Well, of course, that would be great to have a full-scale online business, Peter. But what about if our product is more complex, has longer sales cycles and require resources on the ground? How do you find the most attractive markets in that situation?
Yeah. Now, if you cannot operate virtually, then I'm afraid the answer is a little more complicated. But let's start with what we could call the easy case. And the easy case is where you don't have to pick the market will pick you. And let me just change the slide here. The situation where the market picks you is often the case with large projects in narrow niche markets, where there are only very few competitors and where you have some sort of obvious competitive advantage. Such an advantage can be on the product side, where your solution is very innovative, and if you have an innovative solution that is attractive to visionary customers. But it can also be a better product market fit for certain types of customers. Your product may not be the most innovative, but you have references that match perfectly with what some customers in other countries are looking for. I actually have several example of such situations in the book where software vendors only pick a market when there is one or more customers ready to engage. The business case can then be built on top of these references, which takes out a substantial risk of your international endeavor. Now, if your company fall into this category, then you must have a team of people who can travel the world and convincingly represent your product and your company. And these people must have the skills to qualify and develop the opportunities that present themselves. The sales process in such cases is normally long and expensive, so you must ensure that you have a high probability of winning the deals. Otherwise, it is much better to pull out early. But I guess that is probably a subject for another webinar in its own right, how to qualify big projects.
Okay, great. Having customer find you would be great, of course. If you can apply this approach, how do you make sure that they find you, and how do you develop them to become paying customers?
Yeah, that's called marketing, sales development and sales. And I'm very glad you asked that question, because I just recently published a 23-page ebook explaining the 10-step process that will make you visible to potential customers all over the world. And on top of that, those recommendations I make in ebook, you should be prepared to travel to meet the customers. You need a budget for traveling to meet with those customers that express a genuine interest and where their main decision criteria do match your value proposition. I actually once had such a job myself, where I traveled the world to meet with potential customers. And we had a very unique value proposition. So within a couple of years, we had projects in Norway, in Belgium, in New Zealand, in the UK, and in the USA. And each of these projects were profitable in their own right. There are more details on this and other similar business cases in my book.
Very well. And let's discuss the situation where you need a presence in the market to win the first customers, Peter. I suppose it is usual for B2B software in a certain price class where there is some level of local competition. In such situation, where we cannot escape from investment, how do you pick the best markets? How do you decide the starting point?
Right. So the question here is where should you start? The premise is that you can only start if you have some sort of organization, some people on the ground in the country that you want to penetrate. So should you take Germany before the UK, or should you start in the Nordics, or should you go directly for North America? Or should you start in the countries that are close to you? That's the sort of questions that people will ask themselves. Again, if you have been able to generate international business virtually, then you may already have an installed base from where you can expand. And working from a position where you already have reference customers is much preferred over starting from scratch. You can consider, are there ways these customers can recommend you to other customers? Are there resellers or distributors that could represent you? So in investing time considering how you can leverage from a position of strength can ease the journey and mitigate the risk. Now, if you don't have a position anywhere, or you don't have a position in the country that you want to go into, if you essentially start from scratch, then you must somehow rank the countries and verify their potential market before you invest. So how do you do that? the United Nations has 193 regular members and 2 countries that are non-members. That's the Holy See, the Vatican, and the state of Palestine. So let's say that we have close to 200 countries in the world. We cannot make a market analysis for all 200 countries. That's impossible. So how do we bring that number 200 down to a manageable short list? Well, you see, most countries in the world are very tiny markets that you will not consider until later, or unless you receive some qualified inquiries. So there are less than 20 countries in the world that represent more than 1% of global demand. And some of them are off limits for other reasons that I will get back to. You can find a list of all countries in the world ranked according to their general potential in my annual report called the Bech Index. And I just recently published the 22 edition. The price for the report is €4.99, but if you watch this webinar, you can get a copy for free. All you have to do is send an email to Burak, and he will forward a link from where you can download your complimentary copy. And the link is active a week from today. However, I would not exclude countries just because they represent less than 1% of global demand. There are circumstances such as language, social physics, culture, and some other issues that make even smaller countries in your immediate vicinity attractive. And also countries where you can use English may be more attractive than countries where you have to invest in an additional language for your product and all the marketing and sales activities. So in most B2B situations, I would always look at the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands and maybe Belgium. And why is that? That is because these countries are open cultures. That's because you can communicate in the B2B environment in English, and because the very high cost of living in these countries motivates companies and the government for that sake to invest heavily in what we call digital transformation. And digital transformation, that's anything that can reduce cost, especially labor cost, that can remove friction, and that can improve convenience. So by using your common sense and maybe some help from your foreign service and your embassies and your industry association, you can normally point to between 5 and 10 countries that potentially could be attractive. So good, let's say that we have 7 countries that we have identified, they could be potentially attractive. What do you then need to know for you to rank them? How do you know which one is more attractive than the other? Again, it depends on your product and your overall go-to-market approach. And you should probably run an internal workshop to identify the 5 to 10 most important parameters that will decide which one is more important or more attractive than the other. And this exercise is what I call mapping the business model environment in each of these markets. And in my book, Going Global on a Shoestring, I describe in detail how you do that. How do you map the business model environment? It's not a method that I have invented. It's actually been developed by Alexander Osterwalder. He's the Swiss fellow who wrote the book Business Model Generation, a book that I can highly recommend. And the business model analysis, the business model environment analysis is described in the same book. But let me give you here the 5 parameters that I find you in all cases must consider. So I will go through these 5 parameters, and then later on we can discuss how do you find the data for these parameters. And the first parameter I will mention is political stability and transparency. Now, 3 to 4 months ago, this parameter would not have been the first one that I would mention, but today it is. So no one in their right mind would consider starting up a business in Russia, for instance. That was not the case 3 to 6 months ago, but today you wouldn't do that. In Ukraine, maybe, but not in Russia. China is also out of the question for the time being, and I would even put India on a waiting list. The risk is simply too high. That may change, and hopefully it will, but right now you must be careful. I would even be hesitant to consider several countries in the Middle East and Africa. So if I was to rank countries for international expansion, I would only consider countries that have a score of at least 50 in terms of transparency, as measured by the organization Transparency International. As a rule of thumb, doing business in countries with high levels of corruption is way too risky for a small company. And please let me stress, this has nothing to do with my political inclinations. It's about minimizing your risk. And of course, there are exceptions. If you can avoid contributing to the corruption in a country or even support the fight against it, then it can be justified. But in general, go for countries where it is easy to do clean business. That was the first parameter. The second parameter is gross market potential. It can either be expressed in value, in market value, or in number of customers. The more customers, obviously, the better. Looking at the entire world, China will always be number 1, the USA number 2, India number 3, Japan number 4, and Germany number 5. But as you probably can sense, I don't think that choosing markets only by considering their size makes sense. The 5 biggest markets that I've just mentioned are in general, but not always, but in general, the most difficult in the world. However, the markets that make it to your shortlist must have some level of potential. So if your product is addressing a certain type of customers, a vertical industry, for instance, or big enterprises, then you need to know how big that segment is in the country that you consider. If there is only, let's say, 100 potential customers, then you will probably resort to another approach than the traditional, where you invest first and harvest later. The third parameter I will mention is an assessment of the competitive landscape. You see, very often a market may be blocked because one or more competitors, global or local, actually own the customer base. And your product and value proposition are not sufficiently different to make them switch. However, in other situations, a market may be wide open, exactly because there is no local competition, or the local competition is weak. The more niche your market is, and a niche is something you define yourself, the more niche your market is, the often you find weak competition. Now, you must map the competitive landscape and carefully define a position that is sufficiently unique without placing you outside the market, of course. And this position has to be compatible with your current position in other markets or in your domestic market. As a small company, you cannot afford to maintain different positions in different markets. Only very big companies can afford that, and even they try to avoid it. So that brings me down to the fourth parameter, and that is the cost of localization. Now, until now in this webinar, we have not talked about the product aspects of running an international software business. And it is also outside the agenda of this webinar, but let me briefly mention the requirements. Before you can take your product to the global market, you need what we call an I-18N version. That's an international version of your software that can then be localized to a specific country. For each country, you then need an L10N version. There's much more in my book about these issues, but there is also plenty of information available on the internet. So if you don't have a i18N version yet, then that is the first investment you must make. On top of this version, you then estimate the cost of developing and maintaining the L10N version, which is required for each of the markets that you consider. The fifth and last parameter that I will mention today is identifying a trend on which you can ride or a wave on which you can surf. And let me explain what I mean by that. You see, moving into a new market where you will have to replace solutions provided by local and global competitors is hard. If there is nothing rocking or shaking your market, then that means that nothing is accelerating the replacement rate for the customers. It again means that you must do all the work of convincing the customers to change. And when you've done that, then you can try to sell your solution. You have 2 sales jobs to do, and that is really hard. You should therefore look for something that could accelerate the replacement or adoption rate in your market. It could be a change in local legislation that would force customers to change their IT systems. It could be a competitor discontinuing a product that you can replace, or some other external disruption that will open the market for replacements or adoptions and where you have an attractive value proposition. Now, if you cannot find such a wave and trend, then you should consider if you can invent one. Can you come up with a narrative that could motivate your potential customers to consider a change? Now, even in a situation where you can provide an add-on product as opposed to a replacement product, riding on a wave can help you get established faster. It's my experience that just having a slightly better mousetrap is often not enough for breaking into a new market. So this was quite a long speech, but with these 5 parameters, I think you should always consider them. There may be and probably will be more parameters you should look at, but with these 5, you should be in good shape to get started. When you have decided on the parameters on which you will compare the markets, then you can list them in a 2-dimensional matrix like this one. And on the matrix header row, you have the countries that you have picked and you want to compare. And in the first column, you have the parameters. You may assign weights to the parameters if you believe some are more important than other, but I urge you to keep it simple. Don't make it too complicated.
Okay. My next question is, how do you find the required information to assess the parameters that you have just mentioned and those companies may choose?
Okay, where do we find the data on the parameters that you find important for your market comparison? And there are 3 main sources. The first one is the internet. You must become a black belt ninja in searching the internet. You can find a lot of information for you to compare the countries on the internet. The second source are potential customers, and that's probably the best source. Nothing beats the intelligence you can get from talking to potential customers. And the third source is consultants, partners, suppliers, and others, those that I would call the industry operators. Now, briefly returning to my 5 parameters, the 5 parameters that I mentioned. Corruption and transparency is monitored by the organization Transparency International. That is a global movement working in over 100 countries to end the injustice of corruption. And they publish their findings on their website. If you're looking for demographic information on a country, you can find updated information of that kind in the World Factbook, which is published by the CIA, the American Central Intelligence Agency. You may associate something else with that organization, but they actually publish an excellent World Factbook with data on all countries in the world, and they do that on a regular basis. You can also find demographic data on countries in the International Monetary Fund on their website and from the World Bank's website. They provide excellent and detailed finance information on all countries in the world. If you want to get into industry-specific demographic data, you can look for the national statistical bureaus in each country. They often publish such information. And then there's obviously the LinkedIn Sales Navigator application and other data providers such as Dun & Bradstreet and Experian and the local providers. When we are looking for information on competitors, that is sometimes available from industry analysts such as the Gartner Group, or I think they're called Gartner now, IDC, Forrester, Aragon Research, Ovum, and many others. There are around 750 industry analyst firms in the world. Some of them are operating globally, most of them are all operating regionally and locally. Now, there's no guarantee that your market is covered by an industry analyst. And even when it is, there's no guarantee that the information they provide will be of any value to you. It may be too general, too generic. But sometimes there are information that is relevant, and then paying $5,000 or $10,000 for a report can be fully justified. For instance, if you want to enter the Nordic markets for ERP systems, then we have a local industry analyst that is meticulously mapping that market on a regular basis. So you would definitely want to get that report. In most cases, you will have to do your own competitive mapping or commission someone to do it for you using the internet. There are plenty of consultants available that can do that on a freelance basis if you don't have the capacity or the resources to do it yourself. Now, talking to potential customers is probably the best way to gather or at least cross-check competitive information. And such information is typically a side product of a normal discovery conversation that you will have with the potential customers. I would say if you've had 15 to 20 meetings with potential customers in a country, then you have a very good picture of the situation. Then there is participating in industry exhibitions and conferences, also a good way to get to know the industry and the market. When we're talking about assessing the cost of localizing your software, then you will probably need to engage with an industry consultant that can give you a picture of the situation in the individual country. Talking to customers is also a good source of information. You just have to be a little careful because often customers cannot distinguish between their own needs and the needs of the market in general. So in any case, if you want to go international, you need to establish a product management function to take care of defining and maintaining the national and the local versions. When it comes to defining a trend or a wave or a disruption that can accelerate the change that you can tap into, then it's a little trickier. There is no sort of central information source for that kind of activity. What you will do is you're going to bring your team together, the team that is responsible for international go-to-market strategy, and you compile all the information you have and you look for any sign of a pattern or a wave that is there, or if there isn't, if you can invent one. At least don't stop looking until you found something. As you perform the market analysis, you compile that information into a number that you can enter into your decision-making matrix. And you can either rank the countries on each parameter, or you can assign the value 100 to one of the countries and then index the other countries in relation to this. It's the same thing, but it may be easier to comprehend.
Okay. And what about the situation where you sell through distributors or partners, Peter? I know you have another book about that. Can you leave some of work to them? They should know their markets better than you.
Yes. First of all, I would say, if you have a qualified distributor or reseller showing genuine interest in selling your product, that could be a reason for considering that market. But even if you do that, I recommend you do your homework anyway. You can do it with the distributor or with the reseller. You should never put all your eggs in one basket. And what happens if the market turns out to be attractive, but the distributor or reseller shows out not to be able to perform? And believe me, that happens from time to time. So my recommendation is, certainly, if you have a potential distributor or potential reseller, do consider that as an opportunity to break into a market, but always remain in the driver's seat. Working with independent resellers and partners and distributors, that's great. But the decision to enter a foreign market should be yours, and yours only. And in general, you shouldn't leave an investment you wouldn't do yourself to a third party. In the end, the buck always comes back to you.
Okay. When you use your approach and consider the parameters that you have mentioned, is it always the same countries that make it to the list?
No, it's not. It totally depends on where your domestic market is located. If you are located in Turkey, the first thing you will do is to look to your neighboring countries. If you're located in Denmark, that's also the first thing you would do. And obviously, those countries that you will find are different. So it totally depends on where your domestic market is located and which industry or market segments you addressed. Or address. I recently did some work for a company developing software for robots. Now, more than half of the world's robots are in Asia. So you cannot ignore Asian markets if you are developing software for robots. So even though that those markets are far away and difficult, you have to find ways to get customers there. Now, this company decided to set up an operation in Hong Kong and Singapore. Now, if you sell software to the property and casualty insurance industry, then you will look for countries that have such an industry, and many countries do not. Now, if you provide electronic healthcare solutions for developing countries, then Europe and North America should not even be considered. And if you sell CRM systems to headhunters, and there are such industry solutions, then you would go where the recruitment costs are the highest. And even for generic products, countries are not always the same. The competitive landscape can make you decide to stay away, or the presence of a considerable wave may you decide for you to enter. As an example, in Denmark, we just have had a new legislation that will force about 40,000 small companies to acquire a cloud-based ERP system. That's a compelling event that will force these companies to invest. Does that open the market for foreign suppliers? Probably not, because we have a very strong local ERP supplier industry. But it does shake the market and may open opportunity in some niches. So when you ask, is it always the same countries that make it to the list? No, definitely not. It all depends on the situation.
Okay. I know this question is not really covered by today's agenda, but I am sure the listeners will be interested in the answer. When you have decided to enter a market, are there ways to set up an operation without opening a subsidiary and people on your payroll?
It depends. it depends on how complicated your product is. It depends on how steep and how long the learning curve is for bringing someone new up to speed and enable them to represent your company and your value proposition. Now, if it's not too complicated, it doesn't take too long, then I would say, yes, there are such opportunities for getting your feet on the ground by outsourcing the market development activities. In most countries, you can team up with a local business development agency that perform the activities that I'm showing in the slide here. And you pay them for representing you or performing certain activities. Now, there may be some listeners here from within the EU. And if you're operating within the EU or within the United States, obviously setting up an activity in another country or in another state doesn't require that you have a separate legal entity. But let's talk about the situation where you need a separate legal entity if you want to have people on the payroll. In that case, you can outsource it to an external or third-party business development agency, and you pay them for representing you and performing the activities that I'm showing in the slide here. One thing I would like to stress, because it's often a misunderstanding that I get across, is that you have to pay them a fixed monthly retainer. You cannot hire a business development agency and expect them to work on commission only. That's not going to work. Not in the software industry. It may work in other industries, but it's not going to work in the software industry. So hoping you can find someone that will be happy to develop a market on your behalf based on a commission, that is a pipe dream. Maybe you can find a distributor and award her exclusivity, but even then you must contribute to the initial market development effort. So, but as you said, it's outside the agenda of today's webinar. And if I may do a little additional promotion, this is exactly what my book, Going Global on a Shoestring, is about. And we also did another webinar with YASAD on this subject a time ago, and that has been recorded, so you can listen to that.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I think the time is over. I think there's lots of available sharings on your presentation. Thanks a lot for it. And we can carry on with a Q&A session right now. Dear attendees, you can ask your questions on the Q&A section on Zoom. While waiting, İlhan Bey, Sevilay Hanım, would you like to add something?
Well, thank you, Hans, for this enlightening presentation. In fact, the biggest question for many software companies when they want to go export, when they want to go global, where to start, in fact. And we always expect that our customers take us to other countries, but it's not always the case. So, well, I have a question, in fact. Many of our software companies have faced this situation, like one of their customers has a subsidiary in a foreign country and they want the software company to that country. But the software company, they need to evaluate if it's a really good investment or not. How can we facilitate such a situation, in fact?
That situation is what I call the Trojan horse in my book.
Yeah, can be, yes.
And that is an excellent and a genuine approach to internationalize, to go with your customers. So and let me answer by giving you an example. In our part of the world, some years ago, there was a lot of outsourcing of manufacturing to other countries. Mm-hmm. So in that process, the outsourced entities needed IT systems that could communicate with the headquarter. So that was an opportunity for some companies to go into these markets, and that approach worked very successfully. So we have Scandinavian companies, software companies, that now have considerable operations in the Far East and in Eastern Europe, based on that strategy. Obviously, you need to consider whether there is a market for more than just one customer. So you still have to do your market analysis. But the fact that you already have a reference customer that you can use is a major advantage. So if the subsidiary of your customer is in Poland, then I will definitely consider whether there is additional similar type of businesses in Poland, and if there is, then that could justify an investment in building out the presence in that market and use this subsidiary customer as your first reference.
Wow, thank you.
It's definitely a worthwhile approach to pursue.
There is a comment from Cem Gönen Chen. He says, I absolutely recommend everyone to check that Bech Index reports. Thanks a lot, Cem Gönen Chen, for that recommendation.
I have a question, Peter, about the timing of, I think a natural flow seems like finding some channel partners, resellers, and maybe establishing a local sales force there, regional or country-based. And then finally opening maybe a subsidiary or office there. How do you make the decision of should you go with this flow, or are there markets that justify establishing a sales force or an office?
Well, obviously it depends on the resources you have available, and in my speciality is finding ways that do not require a big budget. I'm also involved in projects where there is a lot of money available. So that you can invest in setting up a subsidiary, you can hire people, and you can actually cover the risk associated with that, because it is very hard to foresee how long it will take to make such an investment to bring that to break even. Will it take 1 year? Will it take 2 years? Will it take 3 years? So if you set up an operation, let's say with 5 people in a country, and you expect it to be to reach break even in 1 year, and it doesn't, then you're very exposed. So when we're talking about going global on a shoestring, I would definitely consider outsourcing. And again, it depends on how complicated your product is, how steep the learning curve is. But if it's reasonable, I would consider outsourcing the lead generation activities to somebody. Now, if your go-to-market approach is indirect, it means that you need resellers to serve your customers. I would, in parallel, do market penetration to generate leads, and then I would look for resellers. Because if you expect to find resellers and recruit them, and they then should develop your market, then it's going to take a long time, number one. And number two, they're reluctant to do that because resellers, by definition, do not have exclusivity. So they will not invest in market development. So for them to get motivated, you need to feed them qualified leads. So you can then feed them qualified leads. You can set up, you can find the resellers that are motivated. And it sounds easy. It's not. And you may even hit a wall where it's not possible to actually bootstrap a market. But if you can get that going, then at a certain stage you have sufficient business to open up your own subsidiary and put feet on the ground. That's the approach that I would recommend if you have a limited budget.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There's another question by Cem Gönençen. What about the pricing in different markets? How should we react about purchasing power parity in small markets and countries?
Yeah,
Good question.
that's a good question. With the level of transparency that we have today through the internet, and also it's becoming more and more common that you actually publish your prices on the internet. Again, that depends on what type of product you have. The more standard product, the more self-service your go-to-market approach is. I mean, customers find you through web activities and they signed up for a trial and then they decide you use your product. Then you normally need to publish your prices on the internet. And if you do that, you cannot have different prices for different markets. If we go in the other end of the spectrum, if you are selling very high price solutions that takes a long time to implement, then that's another case. And then you have more flexibility on the price because your prices are not that transparent. And then you actually can have project specific pricing. But as a general trend, I will say it gets more and more difficult to have price differentiation across geographies.
Yes, is our mail address. You can send me or Hans Peter directly for your questions and for the Bech Index report. Well, thanks a lot for the organization. Thanks a lot, Peter, for your presentation, and to all attendees. It was, I think everybody enjoyed the session. Hope see you another webinar. Have a nice day, and thanks for joining us today again.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.